On November 1, 2011, a Boeing 767 owned by Elot Polish Airlines was operating a flight from Newark to Warsaw. The captain of Flight 016 was Tadeusz Rona, and the co-pilot was Jerzy Swark. The destination airport was Chopin Airport, where the plane was scheduled to land at 1:35 p.m. The plane began taxiing with a 3-hour delay. There was no indication that anything else could go wrong. However, shortly after takeoff, the pilots found a malfunction in the central hydraulic system, in which the pressure dropped sharply shortly after retracting the landing gear. After a brief deliberation, the pilots decide to continue the flight to Warsaw. During the flight, they discuss variants of actions and procedures that result from the malfunction and notify the operations center in Warsaw and the cabin crew of the situation. The 220 passengers do not learn of the Boeing's troubles until the 3rd hour of the flight. During the flight over the Atlantic, the Boeing crew had practiced in advance many times the procedures when landing with a faulty hydraulic system, simply that the plane should be configured for landing a little earlier, as the flaps and landing gear are then released in an emergency. As a precaution, alternate airports were also checked, should there be a need to land earlier, as a result of a more extensive failure of the machine. The Boeing 767 found itself over Europe near the Netherlands, past Germany, heading for Poznan. Air traffic control allowed the crew to descend to 10,000 feet. 20 minutes later at 13:05, SPLPC is already in the area of Warsaw Airport. The controller allowed further descent and turned to the final straight. At an altitude of 1,000 meters and at a distance of about 18 miles from the airport, the autopilot-guided Boeing is almost ready to land on heading 33. Flaps in position 20. The command is given to release the landing gear using the electrical system. A minute passes and no distinctive noise is heard in the cockpit, and none of the 3 lights indicating the release of the landing gear is lit. The crew aborts the approach and informs controllers of the problems with the landing gear, after which they are diverted to the vicinity of Gora Kalwaria, with instructions to make a second approach to the same runway. A second attempt at emergency landing gear release also fails. The pilots again abort the approach and ask the controllers to direct them to an area where they can calmly solve the problem. Captain Rona reports the emergency situation to give the airport services time to prepare to receive the plane, and from that point on, a dedicated controller supervises the Boeing's flight. The SPLPC has an hour's worth of fuel in its tanks. The fluid level in the hydraulic system is only 10%. The crew arranges with the controllers to make a low flight over the airport before landing so that the condition of the landing gear can be assessed from the tower windows. However, there is no need to do so, as an on-duty pair has been picked up from the military airbase in Lask, and it is the F-16 fighter pilots who will take a close look at the belly of the damaged Boeing. After consulting with the mechanics, the SPLPC crew once again tries to release the landing gear with the help of the hydraulic system. After activating the pumps, the pressure in it rose only to 60 units, while it must be 50 times more, and this attempt failed. The Boeing 767 is approached by 2 F-16s, whose pilots asked the SPLPC crew to increase speed. The fighters needed at least 200 knots, while the Boeing was flying at 140 knots. Captain Rona negotiates with the pilots of the on-duty pair for a while, since increasing the speed would require retracting the flaps, which, if the hydraulics failed, could translate into a problem with releasing them again before landing. A compromise was worked out: 180 knots at the expense of greater fuel burn. The news from underneath the Boeing is not encouraging. The fighter pilots report only an extended skid. The landing gear covers are closed to the deaf. Captain Rona thanks the military for their help. It is about 2 p.m. The passengers are already prepared for an emergency landing, and the pilots had previously agreed with the cabin crew not to wait for a command from the cockpit, but to start evacuating the travelers themselves according to their own assessment of the situation. The foam laid on the runway is beginning to fall, and firefighters must once again prepare it for the landing of the Boeing without landing gear. However, they need a quarter of an hour to do this, which the plane's pilots do not have due to the dwindling fuel supply. Captain Rona wonders for a moment what this foam cushion will look like. Will the plane sink into it and see nothing? It turns out that it's just two parallel strips that will soften the friction of the engine nacelles on the surface, where the fuselage itself will not be protected. The machine once again approaches for landing, which, as it turns out, will be its last.
Lot 13 wieża?
15 dzwoni na Direction.
Lot 16 zezwalam lądować. Wiatr przyziemny 104 węzły. Informacyjnie na krótkiej, prostej waszej wyłączymy oświetlenie pasa.
Mamy zgodne lądowanie. Dziękuję.
Lot 16 zgłoś pas zasięgu wzroku.
Zgłosimy pas zasięgu wzroku.
Powodzenia.
The runway lighting has been turned off so that sparks from the torn-out lights won't start a fire of spilled fuel should the tanks leak. With a remnant of hope, the Boeing crew still tries to open the landing gear by gravity, accelerating the plane and pulling it up. Perhaps the landing gear will extend under its own weight. Unfortunately, a belly landing remains. Tadeusz Rona leans over to his colleague in the right seat and extends his hand. Jurek, later there may be no more opportunity. Thank you for your cooperation. The hour is 14:30. The pilots of the Boeing still manage to release the flaps to position 30. When landing on the belly, a lower speed will be needed, and there is no way to go to the second circle. After a while, the machine, weighing 128 tons, approaches threshold 33 at a speed of 240 kilometers per h. Just above the runway, Captain Rona gently raises the nose of the plane to touch down as gently as possible with the rear part of the fuselage. Soon, both engine nacelles touch the runway and the pilots are left with only the task of keeping the plane on its axis. The Boeing 767 came to a halt near the intersection with the shorter strip. While scrubbing on the tarmac, it tore out a dozen lights. Sheaves of sparks came out from under the nacelle, but the fuel fire did not occur. Passengers quickly exited the plane on inflatable gangways, and it appeared that none of the travelers or crew were injured. Many people also said they did not feel the difference between an ordinary landing on wheels and the seating of the plane by Tadeusz Rona and Jerzy Swark. There were 220 passengers and 11 crew members on board the aircraft flying flight LO016 from Newark to Warsaw. Upon landing, the passengers were evacuated by the plane's crew and airport services prepared in advance, and then transported to the terminal, where a LOT Polish Airlines support team and psychologists took care of them. There was no panic on board the plane, and none of the passengers were injured.